So I've been requested to do a video response on Viki 1999's argument on the labour theory of value. I'm not going to go through all of that. I just took out the main arguments that I felt needed to be addressed. It might sound a bit similar to that of previous videos, but of course I was requested to do this response.
The labour theory of value is a core part of why Marxists believe that capitalism is inherently exploitative.
It's rather quite rich for people who support socialism to come out and speak about exploitation by that definition. In the real world, money can only come from two places, the private sector or the printing press. If you do not have a private sector, you're forced to run the printing press. That would drive you right into extreme poverty. The devaluation of the currency results in the poor getting poorer. The rich hold all the assets, of course, but that's not what they want. They want to abolish the private sector. So if there's no private sector to finance the economy, where's the money coming from? Well, of course, they could run the printing press. That's going to drive them into hyperinflation. But the theory of Marxism is really all down to a moneyless based economy. So there's no money, again faced with the economic calculation problem, but that's for a whole other story. There are jobs out there in the economy that have to be done, that require a lot of hard work, and you want to make them work for absolutely nothing on a moneyless based economy, and you cannot see that by your own definition of exploitation that is exploitation, and that's the truly remarkable part.
All the brave defenders of capitalism try their best to debunk it.
I haven't tried to debunk it, I've basically debunked it.
Basically, it's a theory which tries to explain why things cost what they cost, what's their value. And the labour theory of value puts forward the idea that everything gets its value from the labour that was put into it.
The idea that somehow value is determined by the labour that you put into it. Again, that is a misunderstanding of the subjective theory of value, and it's why the objective theory of value of Marxism, of the labour theory of value, is deeply flawed. But it's this idea that you seem to believe that just because you put labour time into something, that this somehow determines value. Well, that's all well said and done. What are you then going to do when you put your product out there on the shelves and nobody's buying it?
This is a bunch of parts a phone is made up of. It's a screen, a camera, a battery, a case, and so on. And if we assemble those, the resulting product will always have a higher value than the individual parts put together. This is because it consists of the parts plus the labor of assembling them.
Again, what this completely ignores is the fact that there isn't one phone, and there are a variety of different phones out there on the market. When you put that phone out there on the shelves, who's to say that it's going to sell? Who's to say that it's more valuable than another phone? It's subjective theory of value. It's the consumer that's going to determine what the price will be. So businesses can't just set whatever price they like. They have to go by what the consumers are willing to pay for something. That's the economic reality of what value really is. Now, something that you produce, and it doesn't matter how much labour time you put into something, doesn't matter how many people you get working on something in terms of labour quantity. When you put that phone out there on the shelves, the real value is going to be determined by what people are willing to pay, and if they don't see value in the phone, they're not going to buy it. In other words, that's where the losses are going to come in, because you spent all that time producing something, you put a lot of valuable time and labour and etc. into something, but if it's not selling, well, you're going to have to be put in a position where you're going to have to sell it for less than what you produced it at. Of course, I don't know where the whole thing about buying things comes into, the whole thing to do with a communist system and communism in theory being moneyless, etc. Viki just goes off the beaten road right into the funny farm.
And the more labour it takes, the more valuable it is.
Again, to say that the more labour it takes to produce something, the more valuable something is, well, if that's the case, then how come with a lot of labour time and with a lot of labour that went into producing the pelts in the Soviet Union was left to rot in warehouses as consumers were not buying it?
Assembling a phone might only take a few minutes and would thus not add that much value to the product. But assembling a handcrafted wooden table takes a lot more labor, so the value of the table is way higher than the value of the raw materials.
Resources itself, the raw materials, does actually still have value, because in one country there might be more of that specific given resource compared to another country. There's value due to the fact that there's scarcity. Of course, when you're talking about tables, there isn't just one table, there isn't just one type of wood. You may have have glass tables for all we know. For example, this table here that I've got here for my desk, people might not like because it's very cheap sort of type of plywood that can be damaged easily. So is that going to be more valuable than that of an oak table, for example? Well, no, not really. So going by your theory then, if they put a lot of hard work into producing a table like this, or a desk, or whatever it may be, so that would make that table more valuable. But there's an issue. Who's to say who's going to buy it?
Everything is just made up of labor. Those raw materials as well. The battery was assembled by someone, and the lithium was mined by someone, and crucially, from that it follows that natural resources don't have an inherent value.
Of course resources are valuable. I mean, it's scarce. One country might have a scarcity of a specific given resource compared to another country, and industries will depend upon those resources, so they do have value to them.
Yes, diamonds are very expensive and have a high value, but according to the labor theory of value, you're not paying for the inherent value of a diamond. After all, it's just a rock. What you are paying for is all the labor that went into getting it to you.
Again, what you're ignoring is the laws of supply and demand. The diamond is actually determined through the laws of supply and demand because there's a scarcity of the diamonds, it's harder to obtain, and of course there's a very high demand for that type of jewellery. You concede and you say that you do understand the laws of supply and demand, then surely you would understand that then, because then you would understand why gold is more valuable than silver and why gold is more valuable than a rock that you would find in your garden. Gold is harder to obtain. There's more risk involved in trying to obtain it from the ground. It's not a case of, oh well, it's just as simple as the fact that, you know, there's more labour put into it in terms of quantity and labour time, and voila, there's its value.
The labor of the person who located the diamond mines, the one who dug up the diamonds, the labor of the person who analyzed its quality, the labor of the person who transported it to you, the labor of the salesperson who tries to convince you to buy this one instead of the less expensive one.
I'm not entirely sure what Marxism has to do with that of salespeople trying to sell a specific given product on the market, which is capitalism, to that of another person to consumers and consumers shopping around. Socialism is about central planning of the economy, and of course you get what's given to you, and it's never been anything to do with what you're explaining. Understand that in the Soviet Union they couldn't go down the road of this full-blown theoretical communist fantasy world that you wanted. They were forced into using prices, they were forced into using the market to some degree. And why were they forced in that position? You cannot 100% on a question of scale get rid of capitalism, expect socialism to survive. It just doesn't work.
All of that labor, which is quite a lot, is why diamonds are expensive and sand isn't. Sand is so common that all it takes to get a kilo is a shovel and 20 seconds.
No. It's nothing to do with the 20 seconds of how much time it takes for you to, get something. That's just absolute nonsense. You've been forced into a concession there. You said that the sand is common. In other words, the sand is in large supply. That's the reason why. Because there's so much of it. So because there's a larger quantity of it in supply, there's a lower demand for it. If there's more of something to go around, you've got less value for it. It's like standing in the middle of Scotland with a bottle of water and you've got a crystal clear river streaming down in front of you. You've got less value for it, so you can pour out the water that you've got and refill your bottle no problem. Whereas you would not have the luxury of doing that in the middle of the Sahara Desert.
Diamonds are rarer, so they need a lot more labor to collect. Since all value ultimately comes from labor, if someone makes money without labor, where does it come from?
Again, it's just like the example of the diamonds. It's really all down to that of supply and demand. And the supply and shortage, therefore, it's harder to obtain. There's more work that's involved in obtaining that. It's not to say that labor doesn't have its value. The cost it goes into producing things. And then on top of that, you've got the price, so determining down to what it's going to sell. Not everything's the same. It's not as simple as just putting it down to, here's the quantity of labour, the average labour time. It's just nonsense.
And the answer is pretty simple. For every dollar someone made without working, someone worked without earning a dollar.
I don't know what job they're working in for them to work and not get paid money. That is exploitation. If they're contracted and they're not getting paid a dollar for working, then the business, whoever they're working for, should get done. And don't get me wrong, there's businesses that ended up in debt and were forced into such a position where workers were not getting paid their money. You could partly blame that down to the current system today, but it doesn't hide the fact that this what the hell, I mean, that's, yeah, I'm lost for words on that.
There are two ways to make money without doing work. Either be a landlord and demand people pay rent, or be an employer.
Oh my god, man. I mean, you're honestly trying to tell me an employer does no work? Who are the ones who are on the phone and in contact, working hard in order to improve their business, to expand the size of their business, etc.? Later you then concede to say that these so-called capitalists take risks with business, and they've always got the risk involved where they have to ensure that employees are getting paid the wages that they do. It's a very stressful type of job. It's not like they do nothing. Maybe because the fact that you don't see their type of work that you think they do nothing, but they do a lot. Saying that landlords do nothing, well, who the hell do you think is the one that does the jobs such as the electrical jobs, ensuring the safety of the rented property that they lend out to people? So it's not just a case of just, oh well, they just rent it out and that's it, and they just sit in their arse and just do nothing. Viki, your type are so childish.
And the way employers make money is simply by underpaying workers. These are our raw material and upkeep costs. This is the value of the finished product, and using very basic maths we can see that our worker provided labor of this value. But now the employer can't make a profit that way, so they pay the worker less.
No, Viki. The costs of production initially is £200, and that is included with the labour. The labour is not separate from the costs of production. It costs you to pay the labour that money in order for them to produce. They're part of the costs of production. So the cost of production was £200. So if it's £200 to produce, that's including the labour. And then you talk about how the capitalist would not make the profit. Yes, they would, because cost and price are not the same thing. And the funny thing is, you later concede and say that cost isn't the same thing as price. Well, if that's the case, then how come you did not acknowledge the fact that a capitalist has to set their price higher than what the cost was to produce it? So the cost to produce it was £200. So what are they going to do? They're going to sell the product at £500. Increase the price to a price, maybe even £800, like the iPhone or whatever. They might sell the phone for whatever reason being for £800. So labour is included in the costs of production. It's not separate. You've separated the two of them.
So first of all, we'll address the argument that there are possible scenarios in which nobody is exploited. This is brought forth by Shane Killian. His video starts off by saying that exploited doesn't mean anything by using the wrong definition. He says exploiting just means to make use of something, and that's true. But Shane, please look at the second definition.
To be fair to Shane, over time they did change the initial meaning of exploitation during the period of the 19th century, and the Marxists took on a definition of their own and began using it as, you know, the mistreatment of workers. That's okay, that's fair enough. I mean, if we go along with your definition, that's not to say that there isn't exploitation, and we acknowledge that fact. There is no such thing as a system without exploitation. So the entire basis of the labour theory of value of Marxism is deeply and inherently flawed.
Investors, they own stock and get paid dividends. They don't labor for those dividends, so they have to be taken from someone who did, and that's exploitation.
Many of those investors had to work for a living and had to work hard in order to get the money that they did. From the money that they earned, they then used that to invest in other things. Now, what's wrong with that? And if they invest in a company, they are taking a risk. You're risking the money that you earned, investing in something that there's no guarantee it will take off. There's no guarantee it will be a success. The way that you look at an investor is almost as if they got money out of nowhere. Well, they had to get money from somewhere in order to invest in the first place.
The next point is made by Back Alley, spelled as one word, philosophy.
If a handicapped person were to, in 6 hours, produce the same output as a regular person could in 1 hour, according to the labor theory of value, the product produced by the handicapped person would be artificially made more valuable simply because it was made by a handicapped person and it took more time to create it.
The theory that value comes from labor can't be true because we all labor at different speeds. Marx noticed that, believe it or not. So when Marxists say labor, what they really mean is socially necessary labor time, which, as you can imagine, is the average time it takes to do that work.
It's this idea that value is determined down to this of the quantity of labour and the socially necessary labour time, the average labour time it went into producing something. That's the reason why we took the piss out of Karl Marx and said that if you dug a hole in the ground and then filled it up next day, and you spent hours doing so, and then hours doing so filling it back up, you've produced nothing. So it wouldn't matter, the average labour time that you spent on doing it, the end value of what you've produced is worthless.
So when Marxists say a table takes an hour to produce, they mean that it takes that long on average.
When you produce that table and then you put it out there on the market, well, of course market's nothing to do with communism, with that of socialism, the average necessary labour time that goes into producing tables. Well, the reality is you put that product out there to the consumers. What's the guarantee that you're going to sell that table?
The labor theory of value, which is that the amount of work you put into something dictates the value of the thing, is a bunch of crap. If I spend all day making mud pies outside, that's an awful lot of work. It's also completely useless. The way that you actually determine the value of work is by trading it for somebody else's work in a fully voluntary fashion.
I'm interested in the first part of the argument here. He says that making mud pies is a lot of work, but also worthless, and that therefore the labor theory of value is wrong. It's a correct conclusion built on wrong pretenses. You see, Ben is changing what the labor theory of value is. If you recall, I described it as a theory which says that everything gets its value from the labor that was put into it. Nobody I've ever met or read from said that all labor is valuable. We agree on this. Making mud pies is worthless.
And that there, folks, is 100% proof that socialists don't even understand the Marxist labour theory of value. What Karl Marx viewed value is basically down to the socially necessary labour time. In other words, that to do with the average labour time that you spent on producing something in relation to the quantity of labour.
The last and, in my opinion, strongest argument is value is subjective. And they wanted to figure out why stuff costs what it costs. The labor theory of value says it's because of labor. Nowadays, most economists don't believe in that anymore, as the libertarians will tell you. Nowadays, we say something is worth whatever someone says it's worth. Value isn't objective because we value different things differently. And yeah, I don't doubt that. Nobody would.
Karl Marx rejected that to do with the subjective theory of value. He viewed value down to that of objective value, and that price was something knowable, that it could be fixed. And the fact that you're now trying to correlate subjective theory of value with that of the labour theory of value, this just proves that you are self-defeating.
No reasonable person would ever say that things have the exact same value for everyone.
The problem with the labour theory of value, it didn't look at the questions of who is it valuable to, at what time is it valuable, in relation to what other given products in the market is it valuable. And Karl Marx viewed prices as something endogenous. He didn't realise that prices are exogenous. You've just rejected the Marxist labour theory of value. You really have. We know this because Ludwig von Mises, what are you saying to us? That Ludwig von Mises, an economist, one of the greatest economists of all time, didn't understand Marx's labour theory of value?
Why do people even listen to this Marx guy?
That's a good question. Why do people actually listen to him? The answer is they listen to him because of the indoctrination through the state education system, through the mainstream media, because they've been dumbed down. That's why they listen to him.
So we assume that objects have a certain value based on the amount of labor that was put into them. But in addition to that, they also have a price. Value is the actual true value of a thing, and the price is what you pay. The way I usually explain it is that the value is the absolute lowest price.
What determines price? Prices are signals, right? And you've just stated there about, the absolute lowest price. So by your logic then, all the lowest prices are all to do with that of what the most valuable products are, from what I'm gathering here. So how do you determine price?
What is that price influenced by? Use value.
Who's to say that what you've produced is going to be of value? Who's to say that you're going to sell the product? That's only going to be determined down to consumers, and consumers driving what production is, consumers driving what sells. Is capitalism.
And this one changes from person to person, so Marxism has subjective value.
The subjective theory of value did not come around until a later date, but it was the likes of Ludwig von Mises who would make the argument on the subjective theory of value. Marxist labour theory of value rejected subjective theory. Now that's how you can tell Marxists themselves don't even understand their own ideology, and that's why it's a waste of time arguing with these people on the subjective theory of value and just the labour theory of value in general, because they completely twist everything and redefine everything and make up their own nonsense. That again, she just doesn't understand economics.